good evening to everybody, to all the friends and comrades here. And I first want to say thank you so much, Sheelu, for making my job much easier. A lot of recent developments and conflicts in this relationship between women and banks has been covered by Sheelu, so I won't be going over any of that. In fact, what I would rather be doing is to present a perspective, drawing on some history on how did the Indian nation state see the role of banks in India's development, and how did this vision change over the decades after 1947. So it's not only a question of what do women expect from banks, but what does the country expect from banks, for banks to be and banks to do. So I hope my audio is clear. If there's any issue with the voice or it's breaking, please let me know. So to begin with, a very brief historical overview, as I said. In the early 1950s, the All India Rural Credit Survey, the first systematic survey of India's credit requirements post-independence in the early 1950s, studied household indebtedness and found that credit from non-institutional sources, that is, friends, family, informal lenders, accounted for 92% of borrowing of cultivator households. And the share of the professional money lender was as high as 44.8%, so nearly 45%. So the Rural Credit Survey Committee report says in a very straightforward manner that the monopoly of the informal lender must be ended, and the goal of the state is to expand and extend formal credit in order to compete with the money lender and displace him. So the words it uses, remove him from the forefront and put him in his place. Right? And also the report is very clear. End the relationship of the goal of the state is to use banks to end the relationship of exploitation when the lender is also the landlord and the borrower is the tenant cultivator. Right? But we all know that it was not until 1969, when 14 major banks of this country were nationalized, that the era of social and developmental banking was really inaugurated. And because the need then was to provide, the need of the hour then was to provide low-cost credit, adequate and timely credit to farmers so they could purchase high-yield variety seeds and chemicals, given the reality of the Green Revolution then, the requirements of the Green Revolution. So the state had to exercise social control of commercial banking sector to achieve this quantum leap in food production. So then we have the era of social and developmental banking, where we have, we have the legacy of that still today, but what we see in that era from the late 1960s onwards is a massive expansion of bank branches in semi-urban and rural areas, the mandate that banks must direct credit to priority sectors, and then defining weaker section within priority sectors, capping interest rates, right? Limiting interest rates on loans made to the poor. So this is when credit really gets incorporated within an agenda of nation building or state developmentalism. So what did the country expect from banks then? That banks must embrace a new perspective, a vision of social justice through the extension of institutional credit. And in this new vision, banks must not limit their concerns to maximizing profit by investing in the most productive channels or uses, right? That's the conventional view of banking. But banks must mobilize their financial resources in the cause of affirmative action and wealth redistribution. Right? So it was really an experiment in social engineering that we saw inaugurated in this era. The larger frame, of course, is that the state is in control of the economy. The state is directing the economy. The state is steering the economy. And the state is intervening proactively to correct for market failures. So as markets have failed to fulfill the credit needs of the rural masses of the population, the state is stepping in, right? So this is the justification, this is the rationale, and this is the frame as well. But as we all know, from the early 1990s, with the rise of a global agenda, not just the Indian agenda, but the global agenda of deregulating financial markets or unshackling financial markets from state control, India also then was subject to the same set of influences. Indian banking sector reforms inaugurated by the Narasimham Committee reforms effectively ended the era of social banking. Right? And it's important for me to just note this point here, that these reforms were concerned primarily with improving the financial efficiency of the banking sector and with and benchmarks. The new benchmarks that emerged were to assess the performance of banks and shift it away from the goals of social banking. So banks are not going to be assessed on whether they have attained the goals of social banking anymore, but on profitability and portfolio quality, right? And we all know the consequences of this, and I don't have to go into this. There is a fall in bank credit, a massive fall in bank credit going to rural areas, to agriculture, to the small scale industries. There is a redefinition of the priority sector itself in such a way that newer subsectors like venture financing, right, or the software industry are being included within the umbrella of the priority sector, right? And it's the idea of harnessing or mobilizing the credit system to help beat weaker sections that really comes under very severe attack. Now, this is all very well documented, and I don't want to go into any of the data here, but I do want to emphasize one thing, which is that it is precisely from this period onwards, which is the early 1990s, when self-help group based microfinance is really born in this country, right? Its origins are in the same period, with NABARD and the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, issuing circulars and urging banks, encouraging banks to lend to women who are organized into SHGs. So then women of rural poor households were encouraged to establish formal ties with banks, right? But this happens, interestingly, precisely during the period that banks are moving away from the agenda of social banking, the agenda of developmental banking. So in some ways, it is a paradox, right? So how do we understand this moment? I just want to place a certain perspective before you, for your consideration. So one way of understanding this or unpacking this is to see that the social banking legacy was not completely fulfilled. Because even during the social banking years, the access of landless poor, the access of land poor sections to bank credit had been very low. For a number of reasons, banks had insisted on physical collateral, land-based lending. Banks did not admit borrowing for household or consumption purposes, right? And NABARD has acknowledged this and has been self-critical of the poor record of commercial banks in financing the rural poor. So the social banking agenda remains incomplete. And at the same time, from the early 1990s, bank priorities, as I had said earlier, were shifting to portfolio quality and disciplined loan repayment, right? So we have both those things happening at the same time. What worked in this scenario was that women now, rural women, women from working poor households, were being presented as disciplined borrowers, as disciplined savers and borrowers who could be tracked easily because they did not have the physical mobility of men. They could be morally coerced into repayment better than men. As we know, the moral economy of shame always works more effectively in the case of women than it does in the case of men. And this, by the way, was already established by the example of Bangladesh, our neighboring country, in which those two large MFIs, BRAC, BRAC, and Grameen Bank, had shifted from male to female borrowers en masse in large numbers in the mid-1980s because the staff found men quarrelsome, argumentative, difficult to control, and difficult to enforce repayment. So there was an expectation right from the beginning of India's SHG-based microfinance era that women would be disciplined borrowers. And I found this in numerous occasions when I was researching the speeches and statements of high-ranking bank officials from the early 1990s. Interestingly, there is also this NABARD handbook or manual for bank branches for training rural bank branch officers on SHG banking, which says SHG banking is a cool breeze for sweating bankers. So if you read that manual and you understand, you decode it and try to figure out what it's saying, what it's trying to convey is the banker is sweating because the banker must adhere to the commercial principles of banking now more than ever, right, in the era of the neoliberal economic reforms. And the banker is sweating because the banker must simultaneously meet the mandate of priority sector lending. But in order to help this situation, we have the cool breeze of disciplined women borrowers because banks are now lending to groups and women will monitor each other and enforce repayment, reducing the cost of lending or what we call transaction costs for the banks. Now, so much about banks. How did this work from women's perspective? I have always understood self-help groups as a pressure group making bottom-up demands on bankers. That was as important, if not more important, than NABARD and RBI circulars pushing bankers to lend to SHGs. What was as important, like I said, was this grassroots level, bottom-up demand from women clamoring for rural credit, right? So 1997, when I began to work with SHGs in Kanyakumari district, they had established relationships with bankers, but they told me stories of women coming back in tears, verbally abused and humiliated by bankers only 2 years ago, 95, when they began to first approach bankers, right? So the way I saw SHGs were that women were knocking on the doors of banks, informing banks that you could ignore us as individuals earlier, but no longer, as we are organized as collectives. And SHGs then are pushing banks, pressuring banks in order to realize the promise of the welfare state or the developmental state. And by the way, I just want to put here on record that women did keep their end of the bargain. If they were represented as disciplined borrowers, they were disciplined borrowers. Repayment rates were as high, have been as high as 98% on loans to SHGs made by banks. And we all know who the big defaulters are, and they're not women in SHGs for sure. My field research with SHGs also found often a different set of rules for internal or SHG loans and bank loans where the women were concerned. SHG loans could be repaid later, but where bank loans were concerned, loans that the SHG had borrowed from the bank, the women followed a nil tolerance of default policy, right? They would not tolerate default or delayed repayment of any bank loan. So they would be flexible with group loans, like you can repay in 10 months, in 12 months, you pay the interest together for 2 months if you can't repay it each month, but they would not show any flexibility to their members in case of bank loan repayment. So they clearly prioritized, they bent over backwards to become those disciplined borrowers. And what was the reason? Because of the fear of losing the goodwill of the bank manager, the fear of antagonizing the bank manager. The bank manager was the most valued external contact of the SHG, any women's SHG, and I think that remains the same. Everybody else queues up behind the bank manager, right? You have the district collector, BDO, NGO, all of them are placed in a hierarchy where the bank manager comes first. And I also found that women often made gifts to bank when they got loans. They would give, I have seen gifts of steel cupboards donated to the bank by the SHG. Whenever the SHG got a loan with a subsidy from the bank, then good managers, right? Managers the women really liked. When they retired, the women would organize parties, farewell parties, and they would give even a gift of gold jewelry, gold ring, a gold chain, and so on to a bank manager. Of course, one way of seeing this is the reverse flow of resources from the poor to the banks. But the point is not for us to approve of this or disapprove of this, but to recognize that women in SHGs invested in this relationship because there was a lot at stake for them, right? As they saw it, getting a good manager was a blessing because structurally the relationship was not an equal one. That's why the individual bank manager became so important, because the bank had the power to judge, to assess whether an SHG was credit worthy or not, and to either approve a loan or deny a loan. And there have been multiple instances from my research as well and other people's research that I had a look at, which showed that this relationship was not an easy one, not an automatic one where women were concerned. There were numerous instances of branch level officials, staff being rude and showing women disrespect, more so when women were poorer or visibly from Dalit communities. So bank staff did respond to visible signs of caste and class status of SHGs and their members in the way in which they treated SHG members. As Sheelu was saying, this goes back. There was a refusal to explain the terms of credit to women. So women found this relationship, although they valued the banks, they found this relationship a troubled relationship because banks simply would not have the patience or the time to explain how interest was calculated and deducted on the loans, or even explain what the rate of interest was. Attending to women last when they came to meet them in banks, or making them return without accepting the deposit, saying, no time today for you, go back, come back another day when we have less work to do. And this was blatantly unfair, as I saw in many instances, forcing an SHG to take responsibility for repayment of older loans made to male kin of SHG members, right? So if an SHG had 20 members, 5 of them, their father or father-in-law or husband or brother or son had taken a loan under an earlier scheme, the SHG was under pressure to return that amount, to make sure those families return the amount to the bank. If not, they would have to, the particular woman would have to quit the group. So when I was doing my research, I also noted cases of bank-induced dropouts. women were pushed out of groups because their male kin, husband or brother, had a loan to the bank, they were unable to repay it, and they had to leave the group, right? And eventually, the effort and time on the part of the group leaders, right, the president, secretary, and treasurer, to chase banks, repeated visits to finally secure a loan, whether it was a linkage loan or a subsidy loan. They would often tell me, we'll never ask for a loan again. But the women knew they would do it again, because what other option did they have, right? So, and to be fair to them as well, because I want to present both sides of the story of this relationship, bank managers also faced non-recruitment of staff in rural branches. They were overworked. They were irritable because they were overworked. I'm saying this both from my research as well as a lot of other research also that I've looked at. But of course, whom they could show that irritation at was shaped by caste, class, and gender dynamics clearly. Also, and I think I'm coming to the end of this, but I do want to make this point that bank level personnel, staff at all levels, knew that the wind was blowing in the other direction. What do I mean by that? I mean in the post 2000s in particular, they knew that the era of social banking was over. And banking with SHGs was an add-on. It's an addition, it's an add-on. It was no longer integrated within an agenda, a larger agenda of social banking or developmental banking. Because this vision of harnessing banks for a larger social good was no longer there. That vision had gone away, right? So it is in this context that I want to place the idea that SHG banking is certainly banking with poor women, but does not become pro-poor banking or gender-sensitive banking, right? And I think we need to be able to distinguish that banking with poor women does not have to be pro-poor banking, and it certainly does not have to be gender-sensitive banking. What did women expect? They expected bankers to respect their dignity and their personhood. They expected them to be sensitive to their life circumstances, their lived realities, and to be mindful of their work burden and responsibilities, both at home and outside. And also, this is important, women of SHGs expected to have a continuous credit relationship with banks, right? They would repay one linkage loan and become eligible for the next. And they expected that the credit flow from banks would continue, which is what policy is, right? So women got the policy perfectly. But practically, this did not work out. Because very often where the bank was concerned, this was a one-shot injection, like one-time injection. Maybe a second time, but that was the end of the story. And banks remained reluctant to finance the credit needs of rural households on an ongoing basis through women's SHGs. So in fact,
2 minutes.
Yeah, sure, 3 minutes. In fact, there has been a stagnation and decline in the SHG bank linkage program in terms of the growth rate of the SHG bank linkage program. The number of SHGs reached the quantum, the volume of credit after the year 2010. Another part of the problem has been the rise of MFI competitors, right, to SHGs. Now banks want to lend, since 2010, banks want to lend to MFIs because that's more economical for them rather than lend to SHGs. So one loan of 10 crore to an MFI obviously is more economical for a bank than hundreds of loans of 2 lakhs to so many hundreds of SHGs. And, but I also want to point out, Sheelu has also touched on that, but I do want to say that the MFI borrower relationship is problematic also because remember in that model, the woman borrower does not control the terms of credit. She doesn't decide the savings, she doesn't decide the loan repayment, she doesn't decide the interest rate. Whereas the SHG is a user-owned and user-controlled model in which women decide how much they will save, what is the rate of interest, how they will borrow, if someone can't repay a loan, what will they do, etc., etc. But the fact that banks have been unwilling and refusing to meet the credit needs of SHGs has sadly made SHGs dependent on MFIs. So here I would lay the charge entirely at banks. So in a sense, one can say, and it won't be an exaggeration to say, that banks have sort of pushed SHGs into the arms of MFIs. So while we condemn MFIs for a number of reasons, for a lot of their coercion, etc., we have to also realize where the source of the problem lies. So I just want to end this then by saying that what women expect, therefore, my last point is pro-poor and gender-sensitive banking and a just deal for them. What can deliver this? A combination of SHG banking as a tool to organize women to continuously make demands on bank, alongside macro policies that favor the interests of the poor. You can't have one without the other. One without the other doesn't work. You need both sides of the equation here. We need to reassert the spirit of social banking and make credit available to the rural sector, to weaker sections within the priority sector, to village and cottage industries in rural India on a priority basis so that SHGs may get a fair deal. So the way forward is to regulate MFIs but finance SHGs. SHGs are organized and they have proved themselves time and time again. But will banks deliver results and keep their end of the bargain? Remains to be seen. Thank you.